parental burnout can increase the risks for neglectful and violent behaviors toward the children. Because it's very important, it has very serious consequences, researchers are studying what variables are linked to higher or lower levels of parental burnout. And among other variables, they found that emotional regulation, co-parenting, and parenting may play an important role. So, for example, studies are showing that the lack of skills to control emotion, little co-parental support, and the lack of positive parenting practices are linked to higher levels of parental burnout. And what researchers are also showing is that the pandemic period has impacted in many ways the family, and it has also impacted these three variables. So the levels of emotional regulation, the capacity to control their emotion, the co-parenting relationship, and also the parenting activities. And because you know all this evidence, the first objective of this work was to understand differences, if there were differences for fathers and mothers on the impact of the pandemic on these three variables: emotional regulation, co-parenting, and parenting, and also if fathers and mothers experience burnout, parental burnout, on different levels. And most importantly, we also wanted to know how this impact of the pandemic on emotional regulation, co-parenting, and parenting could explain variations in parental burnout for Brazilian fathers and mothers. So how this impact of the pandemic would explain the levels of parental burnout on fathers and mothers. For that purpose, we count on the participation of 454 fathers and 600 mothers. All of them were between 16 to 61 years old. Most of them were married or living as married at time of data collection. Most of them also had 1 or 2 children. And regarding the child, they were between 2 and 11, and almost half of them were boys and the other half were girls. These parents, they answered to a social demographic questionnaire, which, among other questions, we asked parents about the perceived impact of the pandemic on parents' relationship with the child, so trying to understand this impact on parenting, on parents' ability to regulate emotions, the impact on emotional regulation, and also the impact of the pandemic on how parents relate and organize themselves to take care of the child, so the impact on co-parenting. These parents also answered to the Brazilian Portuguese version of the parental burnout assessment, which is a measure already validated for use in Brazil, which assesses the levels of parental burnout. Data collection was carried out online from July to December 2021, so it happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. And with this data, we used mean comparison tests to understand these differences among fathers and mothers. And we also used circular equation modeling to understand the influence of the impact of the pandemic on the levels of parental burnout for fathers and mothers in Brazil. So I'll first show you the results regarding the differences between fathers and mothers. And here I present to you the results only for those comparisons that was significant different between fathers and mothers. So you can see there is no result for the impact of the pandemic on co-parenting, because there was no difference for these variables between fathers and mothers. But there was differences on the impact of the pandemic on parenting, on emotional regulation, and also on the levels of parental burnout. When we see the means, we can see that overall, mothers, they had worse results than fathers. So if you look the numbers for the impact of the pandemic on parenting and on emotional regulation, we can see that mothers, they perceived this impact as more negative than the fathers. And also the levels of parental burnout, they were higher for mothers when compared to fathers. But if we consider the effect sizes, we can see that the effect size for the difference in the impact of the pandemic on parenting is very, very small, is very low, it's 0.16, but it's higher when we look at emotional regulation and parental burnout, 0.43 and 0.31. So these are more important differences between mothers and fathers. Now getting to the results in which we show the impact of the pandemic on parental burnout. So the impact of the pandemic on parenting, emotional regulation, and co-parenting, how these would explain different levels of parental burnout. I'm going to show you these results separately for fathers and mothers. And first, considering the fathers, what we can see is that all three variables that we analyzed as antecedents of parental burnout, they significantly impacted on the levels of the syndrome, of the outcome variable. So the worst they perceived, fathers perceived, the impact of the pandemic on parenting, emotional regulation, and co-parenting, the higher the levels of parental burnout for all three variables that we analyzed. Now, when we look to mothers' result, what we see is that differently, only one variable significantly impacted on the levels of parental burnout. So only the impact of the emotional regulation was predicting different levels of parental burnout for mothers. And again, the worse they perceived this impact, the higher the levels of parental burnout. Now getting to the results, what we can conclude, getting to the conclusion actually, what we can conclude taking the results in consideration is that when we have a crisis context, such as the pandemic, emotional regulation seems to be an important variable in maintaining the well-being of parents, both fathers and mothers. And why can we conclude that? Because the impact of the pandemic on emotional regulation was the only variable with a significant effect for mothers in predicting different levels of parental burnout. And also it was the variable with the highest magnitude of effect for fathers. So it was the variable that most strongly predicted different levels of parental burnout. Because of that, given the importance of this variable, we consider that emotional regulation should be considered for the development of interventions or programs that aim to promote the emotional well-being for fathers and mothers. So emotional regulation seems to be a very important variable when we consider crisis contexts such as the pandemic. Specifically for the fathers, although mothers had higher levels of parental burnout, when we think about the causal mechanism for parental burnout, so when we see that figure that shows the impact of the pandemic and its effect on parental burnout, we can understand that fathers, they seem to be more sensitive to parental burnout because all variables affected on the levels of parental burnout. So when we see the results for mothers, only one impact of the pandemic was causing higher levels of parental burnout, but not for fathers. For fathers, emotional regulation, co-parenting, and parenting, if they perceive these variables as negative, they would have more chances to develop parental burnout. And again, just for the fathers, child-related issues such as parenting and co-parenting were linked to parental burnout. This didn't happen for mothers. And how can we understand or how can we explain this greater parental sensitivity to parental burnout, including difficulties related to parenting, also affecting on the levels of parental burnout? This could be explained by the learning and socialization process that both boys and girls go through their childhood. So, although things are slowly changing, we can see that still today, through imitation and modeling that can happen by parents or by peers, girls would learn how to behave as women, while boys would learn how to behave as men. Because of that, girls would be better prepared for parenting than boys because they were trained to do so. Once they become mothers, they would be better able to cope with parenting related problems. And fathers, because they were not trained to do so, they wouldn't be prepared. And this problems related to parenting or co-parenting, they would be more harmful for the fathers, and then they would be more likely to develop parenting stress and burnout. That's one scenario. And considering this scenario, where we can see that fathers, they are more sensitive, they are more likely to develop parental burnout. What can we do? And I invite you to think of ideas with me. But one idea is to better prepare men for parenting. As adults, we can provide fathers with resources so they would be better prepared to deal with parenting and co-parenting issues. And as children, we could socialize them to acquire appropriate skills to deal with this kind of problems related to parenting, to co-parenting, and then they would be more prepared to face these issues and less likely to develop parenting stress and maybe parental burnout. So I thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, we're going to have a little time for that now, but you can also contact me via email. Thank you.